46. Takuda wanted to assign the Locust as part of the rear guard for the column, but Dakota advised against it. With the Tatate so emotionally attached to the mech, it would have to lead. Otherwise, said the spokesman for the Tatate, they would probably huddle around the vehicle and refuse to move. Some of them would understand the necessity of getting a move on, but emotion was likely to be stronger. Thus the Locust, piloted by Jacobs and or Goodall, would be up front. The Dest members, and any refugees who volunteered, would form the rear guard. The Tatate and the other humans would mix into the column. The Tatate could help with the wounded as needed. The only real problem with the retreat would be the Tatate themselves. This was birthing time for them, and the eggs were very fragile. They could be carried, but were susceptible to damage if not treated with great care. That would slow the march. In addition, the Tatate wanted to reach the new location, wherever that was, before the birthing took place. They seemed to think it was very important for the young to come into the world at their new home rather than on the march. This would make the Tatate insistent about moving, even though the humans might get tired. And, of course, it would be better to resolve these problems before the march began rather than later. They would have to explain the situation to the refugees, a significant number of whom had opted to follow Takuda and his vision of a better world. It was several hours before first light that the Locust rose from its crouching position and began to move. Goodall sat in the command seat, with Jacobs crammed into the rear of the cockpit. There was so little room that he had to half stand, half crouch behind the seat, trying not to kick any of the spaghetti-like bundles of cables from their moorings. His presence wasn't particularly needed in the cockpit. He had come along simply because he'd rather be with Goodall than anywhere else. Dakota rode perched on the sloping carapace of the center torso, from which he could direct the movement of the Locust toward the far country that was their goal. At the rear of the extended, straggling column were the Dest members and the refugees. Takuda's unit had been small enough when the operation had begun, and had now taken over 100% casualties. All but Parker DeVood had been wounded at least once, and some, like Holland, Busteau, and Horg, had been hit twice. 6 of the original members would never take another hit. All were stiff with fatigue. The human recruits from the enclaves were not in much better shape. The only thing that made them better able to cope with the strain of the march was that they hadn't been involved for as long a period. Takuda had been very careful not to give details about the route or direction of the march to Fullerton, or to anyone else who chose to stay behind. The location of the refugees, which is what they all were now, would become known sooner or later. Takuda preferred that it not be too much sooner. If Vost came after them with the Javelin and Panther, the column might be able to hide. But if the mercenary used the Lamb, its altitude and speed would make discovery a certainty. Takuda hoped that Vost would be trying to conserve both the Lamb's and the Javelin's assets from running out too soon. That might make him prefer to hold the Lamb in reserve. At least, so Takuda hoped. The Tatate with the rear guard addressed the task with their usual exuberance. They were masters of the woods, and they cheerfully constructed deadfalls and pits to catch the unwary enemy mechs. They were encouraged to create more and more of the infernal devices when the Javelin, overconfident in its armored might, actually tumbled into one of them with a resounding crash. From his own cockpit, Vost saw the Javelin go down. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. He knew immediately what had happened, and began to send a continuous string of venomous remarks and sarcasms over the comlink until he saw the mech climb out of the hole. Vost had already had his own problems with the pit, and he was glad to see Pesht also looking like a fool. The presence of pits made Vost call for ground support as well as the Lamb. The fleeing column would be difficult to find in the triple canopied rainforest, and he didn't want his valuable mechs damaged by some over-enthusiastic infantry type. He had plenty of foot sloggers available, especially since the influx of those who had recently defected from Takuda. With these people more than willing to show their loyalty to their new master, he sent them in on their prey. If they got killed, Fos reasoned, there would be fewer to pay, and more to split among the survivors. The new recruits fell on Takuda's rearguard with a will that bordered on desperation. They knew that this was their chance to go for the bonus money. Do it now, or lose out completely with what Fos had said. They attacked the screen with desperate courage, apparently ready to tear each other apart to become part of the mission. Takuda and his people saw them coming as Vost's new recruits crashed through the trees in their untrained, blind urgency to find and destroy their enemies. It was easy. Too easy for trained warriors like the Dest team. First Holland, Horg, and Knight fired quick warning shots with their lasers into the trees above their heads. But that was worse than a killing shot. The attacking foot soldiers took it as a sign that their enemy was not a good shot, and so presented little danger. They became more bold, shouting to each other in their excitement. There is nothing more invigorating than to be shot at with no effect. That truism has been around for thousands of years, and it was just as valid in these deep woods of this uncharted world. Those who had been missed now felt themselves invulnerable, immortal. On they came. That was when Takuda's men got down to some serious shooting. The Dest members were superbly trained marksmen who could drill an enemy through the eye, you choose the eye, at 150 meters. But the killing did little to reduce the enthusiasm of those soldiers. Those who'd been shot at and missed had been quick to report that fact to their hidden friends. Those drilled through the eyes did not report that fact to anyone. And so the foot soldiers came bounding through the trees. All the while the Dest members continued to take them out. The human refugees were not as successful. A few had subguns and pistols, but most were armed with the same archaic muzzle-loading weapons as their attackers. When those groups came into contact, there was much bloodletting. The refugees and the Dest people had worked out their tactics for dealing with the vanguard of the Vost troops. When one of the rebels saw an enemy, especially if that enemy were in danger of closing, he would shout a warning. The nearest Dest member would react at once, arriving, with luck, in time to provide fire support for his side. Then the Dest member would drop back and await the next encounter. It was not so effective when a Tatate was involved. The little aliens, caught while digging a pit, could not call for support. Most of them had not mastered the language of the humans, and the humans could not tell one Tatate cry from another. The result was that when a Tatate encountered the vanguard, he or she usually died before help could arrive. The refugees with Takuda were not accustomed to helping Tatate, in any case, so the only help the bird-like creatures could hope for was from Takuda's people. When a Dest member was close by and knew of an encounter, he was quick to react, but mostly, the Tatate suffered casualties. Well, all those bitter little skirmishes were being played out under the canopy of the thick forest. Seagroves and his lamb were out looking for the head of the column. The lamb cruised through the tall canyons of clouds, its twin-allied AVR-Tech 125 jet propulsion units throttled back as low as they go without sending the lamb into an uncontrolled stall. The IR sensor and the motion detector systems were set on high area scan so that they swept back and forth over the broadest possible area. Seagroves had also turned the sensor warning klaxon up to its greatest sensitivity so that he didn't have to pay attention to the plot. This was flying the way it was meant to be, almost silent, almost like being a piece of the clouds themselves. Knowing that he was alone in the vault of blue and white, he could go anywhere without fearing hostile activity. He slid between a pair of towering white columns and butted his way through an errant vaporous arm that reached out across the gulf like a gigantic ethereal arch. The cotton whipped past the canopy, and the lamb drifted out over a vast chasm that fell away to the green carpet below. Then, suddenly, the klaxon went off with an insistent screech. Both IR and motion sensors had discovered something 6 kilometers below. Seagrove sat forward against the restraining harness and adjusted the tuning dials to bring the digital scan to finer scale. The plot plan reduced to a smaller and smaller area until the twin sensors indicated the same target. Red corners descended on the small single blip until they converged as a single reading. Target identification scrolled across the HUD. A locust, moving at a walk, fully armed. Seagrove studied the 8-digit coordinate readout and called Vost with the information. He waited for a reply, then rolled the lamb over in a gentle dive. The pilot's problem with the lamb had to do with target location. Deep in the trees, the IR and the motion detectors gave accurate information, but there was no chance of visual lock and identification. That would mean that he would be firing the laser battery on instruments only. That was an acceptable procedure, but in this case, Seagroves knew that there was intervening terrain. The trees, triple thick with overhead cover, would have been easy for a multiple short-range missile system or PPC. The heavy weapons would pound through the crud and bore in on the target. The lasers, however, would strike the leaves and make them flash into steam. With enough laser energy directed at the leaves long enough, the same thing would happen. But diving on a moving, even a slowly moving target at 900 kilometers per hour did not allow enough time for the lasers to bore through. He could scare the target, but unless it stood still and fought, there was no way he could get to it. The lamb came screaming over the trees, and Seagroves triggered the full battery as his screen went green. There was a flash of steam and a momentary glow as the laser energy bit into the foliage. Then the lamb was past the target and into a gentle climb. He checked the sensors. The target was still moving, putting new foliage between it and its attacker. As Seagroves pulled up into a gentle hammerhead stall, the fuel expenditure light flashed and began beeping. The light came on when the fuel load reached half value, and the tone would continue at 30-second intervals until the tanks were dry. He still had plenty of fuel for this mission, but now there was something else to think about. He didn't need either the light or the noise. Seagroves reached forward against the harness and twisted the light from its bayonet socket, silencing the beeping at the same time. He would replace it when he landed. It went against his training as a pilot to allow the light to remain out, a known gig on the maintenance report. And Elizabeth Hund, his senior tech, would be all over him like a blanket if he didn't report it. But, then again, even if he ran out of fuel, he could always glide in and walk the mech home.